The 2024 Polyglot Gathering is brought to you by Glossica.
Hello everyone, we are sorry we're late. We've had some technical difficulties, but now we can start. Thank you for your patience, and our next talk for today comes from Dr. Carlos Yebra López. Its title is Chabacano, the Final Frontier of Global Spanish. And I would like to remind you that you can, for the questions, you can use the Slido website or the Slido app, and where you can enter the code, the event code PG2024, and at the end of the presentation there will be some time to ask questions. And now the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for your kind introduction. And today I'll be speaking about Chavacano. How many of you are familiar with the language, as in, I have heard about Chavacano? Oh, that's a lot. Good, very good. Well, as you can see in the subtitle, it is the final frontier of global Spanish. So my presentation will have two main parts, followed by two others. And the first one is going to be the Global Hispanophone, because the talk is not exactly about Chavacano. Perhaps if you have a very specific question about Chavacano, it may not be pertinent to you. But it is not so much about it, but how Chabacano is part of the Global Hispanophone. And what is the Global Hispanophone? It's essentially how Spanish is spoken throughout the whole world, and particularly about the tension between Spanish from the Iberian Peninsula as the language of the empire and Spanish spoken around the world. And that includes not only dialectal variety vis-a-vis modern Spanish, but also languages that are related to Spanish, whether it is Judeo-Spanish, Chabacano, Palenquero, etc. And so in that sense, I'll be discussing the Global Hispanophone. So the name Chabacano, if you know Spanish, you might have come across this word. The name Chabacano with a B as opposed to a V, but we can find the name of this language either way, means vulgar, right? And it means that by extension, the language is connotated as unsophisticated, not worthy of prestigious literature, right? And that really is at the crux of the matter on how and why Chabacano is important. If you go to the Spanish Royal Academy's dictionary, you'll see this definition. Chabacano means grosero o de mal gusto, right? As opposed to fino, delicado, sophisticated, refined. And that speaks of the tension that I just referred to between Spanish from the Iberian Peninsula as the language of prestige and the most prestiged linguistic variety, because there's nothing intrinsically prestigious about it, rather a process of prestigiation, and Spanish around the world. And so the Global Hispanophone has been described as a space of tension between, on the one hand, Spanish as a language of imperial power, as I just said, and on the other hand, Spanish as a language that spawns creative responses to power, often through non-standardized uses that are considered or deemed inferior because they are non-standardized, right? But that is obviously a value judgment. The question then is, how do we ensure that the Global Hispanophone contributes to diversity and plurality rather than silencing it? And the answer is, if we want to do that, we need to expose the power asymmetry between peninsular Spanish and Spanish around the world as something that is contingent, as something that is not justified a priori, but that involves a long process of ideological and physical colonization. So there are two ways of doing this. We can either take peninsular Spanish and deconstruct the triumphant narrative about it as being an intrinsically universal and global language, or we can take languages that have been traditionally marginalized and stigmatized and show that they are worthy of consideration, just like peninsular Spanish or any other form of language. And that's what we're doing today. We're taking Chabacano, a traditionally stigmatized variety of the Global Hispanophone, and we're showing that there's nothing inferior to it intrinsically, but rather just ideologies of inferiority that have been purported throughout history. So, what is Chabacano? Some W questions, right? First, Chabacano can be roughly defined as a group, rather than a single language, as a group of Spanish-based Creole language varieties featuring Philippine languages as the adstrates and Spanish as the lexifier. And then we have an adstrate, or language that contributes to most of the grammar, in this case, Philippine languages. Right? So that is what we mean by Chabacano. Again, a group of linguistic varieties rather than a single language, and then a Creole, and within that Creole, the lexifier is Spanish, and the grammar is mostly Philippine languages. Now, when it comes to the region where it is spoken, we can see Chabacano being spoken in many parts of the Philippines, but particularly in Zamboanga, which is here, right, on the bottom left. We have many varieties. Some are more influenced by Tagalog, some are more influenced by Cebuano, but the lion's share belong to the Zamboanga variety, so-called Zamboangueño. Now, this is an interesting question that I was discussing prior with Brian Liu, of whether Chabacano is an Austronesian language or not. And there are arguments in favor or against. But many in the scholarly literature just dismiss the very possibility that Chabacano might be an Austronesian language, which contributes to othering Chabacano, to setting Chabacano apart from other languages and saying, no, this is a very special type of quote-unquote language, but it's not a language that deserves our scholarly attention and serious treatment, right? So you can argue that the grammar of Chabacano is a bit more simplified than that of Austronesian languages, but at the same time, it has a pronoun system which is equivalent to them. So there are arguments in favor or against the consideration of Chabacano as an Austronesian language, and what I'm trying to convey is that ultimately it is ideology that decides whether Chabacano is an Austronesian language or not. But from a linguistic perspective, both arguments are possible. Now, here's how the grammar looks like. Say they left without paying for the drink. We want to translate that sentence. They left without paying for the drink. In Spanish from Spain or any other dialectal variety, they will say, se fueron sin pagar la bebida. Maybe you will say el trago in some Latin American varieties, right? It would be, se fueron sin pagar la bebida. By contrast, in Chabacano, it will be, ya sale si la enguay paga con el tomada. So here you can see differences. First, when it comes to making reference to the tense, we have it here in fueron within the same word, right? We use a different word for a different tense. However, in Chabacano, it is marked by a past marker at the beginning, ya, right? Which is in contrast with the present marker ta and the future marker I. So in any case, we're using a marker rather than changing the conjugated form of the verb, as we do in Spanish, right? Then you have sale, which never changes, regardless of the tense you're trying to express. Again, the change is marked by the particle that comes before. And then you have the pronouns, which are different, right? In Spanish, we're using an impersonal, we're using a reflexive form of se, whereas here we're using the equivalent of ellos, ellas, sila, right? Then you also have the difference with the word without, sin or ny, paga as opposed to pagar, again, just one form, and then cunel as opposed to la, and finally, bebida and tomada. And here in bebida and tomada, we have a slight semantic displacement, right? So Chabacano has a word bebe, but that is a general word for a drink and not specifically an alcoholic drink, right? Which is why we're saying tomada in this case, as an alcoholic drink as opposed to coffee or tea. So these are some of the grammar differences. Again, the vocabulary is fairly similar vis-a-vis Spanish, but the grammar structure, the word order, is fairly dissimilar, which means, are they really mutually intelligible? It depends. This is not an objective question. Many people think that I can ask you, oh, are these mutually intelligible? And you can give me a ready-made final answer to that question. But mutual intelligibility is itself premised on other factors. For instance, linguistic accommodation. Knowing the languages that you speak, I may try to use words that are more similar to the languages that I know you know so that you can understand me, right? So that affects mutual intelligibility. Vice versa, if I don't want you to understand me, if I'm using, for instance, a traditionally marginalized language as a code, For instance, I don't want my parents to hear what I'm saying to my sister, then I might try to use words that I'm guessing you may not be familiar with, which also affects mutual intelligibility, right? So mutual intelligibility does not operate in a vacuum. Having said that, let me try to show an example. You will find this video on YouTube. Let's hear it from John, who speaks Spanish and is going to interact with a Chabacano speaker.
My family's from Peru and I speak Spanish.
Hi, my name is Dearly, and I was born and raised in Zamboanga City, which is in the Philippines, and I speak Chavacano, which is a Spanish creole. Muchas gracias.
Zamboangueño, to be more specific.
¿Qué tal tú?
Muy bien, muy bien.
Yo también.
Chévere, yo puedo entender ahorita mismo. Y me llamo Jonathan. ¿Cómo se llama usted?
Mi nombre es Dearly, y ¿cuánto año tú?
Yo tengo 29 años.
Cosa de tu favorito comida?
A mí me gusta algo que es de mi país, que se llama ají de gallina. Y es como arroz con pollo y tiene una salsa picante de pimienta amarilla.
Así na, kami también. Kere-kere gacho come pica comida. Y también takomegat kami manada arroz na Pilipinas.
Ok.
Sí.
Para mí me encanta arroz con casi todo. No sé si a usted también le gusta arroz con casi todos los platos.
¿Dónde tú taqueda?
No entiendo, de verdad.
¿Cuánto hermana y hermano tienes tú?
Yo tengo uno hermano y una hermana. Y los dos son más mayores que yo.
Así, ¿dónde tú mayores ahora?
¿Otra vez?
¿Dónde tú mayores ahora taqueda?
Oh, ellos tienen 12 y 14 años más que yo.
Así, dito yung abuelo y abuela, vivo ba sila?
Yo tengo un abuelo todavía vivo y una abuela todavía viva, pero son de mi mamá y de mi papá.
Yan, nasa iba contigo aquí na Estados Unidos o sabato na otro país?
Solamente mi abuelo. Mi abuela de mi papá, ella se encuentra en Perú.
De Perú.
Yeah, mi
y también
familia es
marido de Perú.
Oh, ¿de verdad?
Sí.
Oh, qué chévere.
Sí.
Ok. Entonces, ¿hablas español con él o no?
Un poquito, pero no sabe que le man cuento español.
Ok. Es súper similar. el idioma.
Bien, bien.
Yeah, porque yo puedo entender casi la mayoría de lo que usted está diciendo, pero no todo. Como hay palabras que no me...
Bueno, yo también te puedo entender un poquito, pero no tanto.
So John, how much of that did you feel like you understand? Or what's your reaction to that language?
So I feel like I understood maybe 80% to maybe a little bit more of it.
That should be a representative sample. Save questions about this conversation for the Q&A, but I think that this provides a lot of material to discuss interesting aspects of intelligibility or lack thereof between Chavacano and Spanish. So what else do we have? We saw all of these. And now we're going to see a little bit about the history of Chabacano, right? So we saw the what, we saw the where, we discussed the mutual intelligibility, and now we're going to see how it started, which again is controversial, and how it evolved. And here we can distinguish between three periods: the early, the middle, and the late. The early period is the most difficult one for scholars. There's a lot of speculation. When did Chabacano start? When it started, was it a pidgin that turned into a creole, or was it already always a creole formed by abrupt creolization? There's a lot of hypotheses involved. And every other article says, oh, this is the final answer to how Ladino was how Chabacano was created. Don't believe them. It's not the final answer. And then we have a middle period. Here we have the first indirect evidences of the existence of Chabacano as a language used by the community. And then in the late period, we have undeniable, conclusive evidence of the existence of Chabacano as a separate language, and a process of decline and attempts to revitalize the language. So let's start with the beginning, which is the Spanish conquest of the Philippines, 1565. And here we have a process of conflict between Muslims and Christians, as part of which there is a slave trade, right? And as part of that process, we have the galleon trade that went from Manila to Acapulco. And that helps explain a lot of the influences that we're going to see in Chabacano. So the idea is that the tornaviaje, which you can see on the left, right, went from Acapulco to Manila once or twice per year. And so you have people in the galleons sharing peninsular Spanish with Spanish from what was then New Spain, which is now Mexico, and then influences from the Philippine languages in the Philippines. We have soldiers, we have Jesuit priests, and from the interaction of all of those people as a lingua franca, we hypothesize that Chabacano was created, or at least the origin of Chabacano, whether it is a Spanish, Chinese, Pidgin, or something similar. And then there is a fort established in Zamboanga in 1635. And that's when we can say for sure that Chabacano begins to exist, because we have a settlement. It's no longer people meeting twice per year in a boat, like this is a Polyglot gathering or something. But it's a settlement, right? It's a place where interaction is constant, ongoing, every day. So that's how a Creole can be born, after the crystallization of the Pidgin, right? So the idea is that the Pidgin is a language that none of the speakers speak as their first language, but in the Creole generation, they already speak that as their first language, because it has been a 15, 20-year-long process of sedimentation. This is the interaction of some of the groups. You can check out the video on Chabacano by LangFocus, which doesn't delve as much into ideological aspects or the Global Hispanophone, but is perhaps more specific when it comes to formal linguistics. So it's a good complement to this presentation. And then we have the expansion, as I said, from 1635. Then that fort of Zamboanga is destroyed and reconstructed again in 1718. And by 1718, all specialists agree that there is already something we can call Chabacano as a distinct language spoken by a sizable community of local speakers as their first language. There are a lot of hypotheses, as I said before, on how this language is created as a Creole, whether it is abrupt Creolization, which means that the Creole just appeared in a short span, whether it is the previous existence of a Pidgin coming from either a substrate of Philippine languages, as I said, languages whose grammar influences Chabacano, or universals reproduced by children, and the importance of the lexifier, in this case, the Spanish European language. Now, then we come to the middle period, and as I said, here's when we first begin to see evidence as opposed to speculation. And so what is the evidence we have? We have a Spanish-Chinese Pidgin that some speculate is the origin of Chabacano. Others say, no, it was just a Pidgin, has nothing to do with the subsequent development of Chabacano. But then we have testimonies of that consolidation. Testimonies of the existence of Chabacano as a daily language rather than a language used for commerce or for utilitarian purposes. So, for instance, we have Fray Martínez de Zúñiga, if you know Spanish. En Cavite y en su arrabal de San Roque se habla un español muy corrompido, again, prejudice at the very origin of conceptualizing Chabacano, cuyo frasismo está enteramente sacado del idioma del país. This is very interesting, right? Because what does Fray Martínez de Zúñiga mean by frasismo? It means word order, sentence structure, i.e. grammar. Right? So the grammar comes from the Philippines. Está sacado del idioma del país enteramente. And then there is español muy corrompido. Why? Because it sounds like Spanish. Some words can be recognized, but it's not Spanish. Therefore, it must be corrupt. Corrupt by opposition to what we deem to be perfect, standardized Spanish from the Iberian Peninsula, right? Again, this is a value ideological judgment rather than a linguistic remark. And then we have the late period. And here we have hardcore evidence by costumbrista stories of the consolidation of Chabacano as a linguistic variety adopted by local communities. The first systematic study was called Malayo-Spanish, literally Malay Spanish. And so in this study, Schuchart says, look, this language no es ya simplemente un continuo chapurreo. I don't know if you're familiar with this word. Where I'm from, in Aragon, Spain, we used to have what we call chapurreao, which was like a mixture between Catalan and Aragonese, which again was deemed inferior to either one, right? And so no es ya un simple chapurreo, es una jerga. Again, it's not a language really, but it's not a chapurreo, it's a jerga. It's more than a chapurreo, but less than a language. Que es el medio de conversación habitual entre muchos indios con postergación de su lenguaje tradicional. Existe ya una especie de tradición, so here we can see that there is a sedimentation process. Se percibe una línea mayoritaria. Los españoles tienen que acostumbrarse a este español de cocina. Spaniards should get used to this kitchen Spanish, right? Español de cocina, which is not the only reference to this language in these terms. We can find the collocation español de cocina many times. O español de tienda, store Spanish. Y acomodarse a una forma de hablar intermedia. Okay? So there is a certain acknowledgement of the existence of Chabacano and also of the fact that we shouldn't take it for granted. I just say, just learn Spanish. Right? 5 minutes, thank you. And then Rizal, obviously, the great writer from the Philippines, also introduced some materials in Chabacano, a couple of dialogues in a couple of chapters of El Filibusterismo, right? I won't read them because we don't have time for it, but these dialogues prove to us that there is something discrete, self-contained, autonomous we can call Chabacano. And finally, in the early 20th century, as it is also the case with other Spanish languages from the global Hispanophone, such as Jaquetia or Judesmo, there is a process of de-stigmatization. People began saying, people meaning scholars, not just lay people, began saying, well, this is a language worth of serious discussion and study. And we have works by Henry Broad, Howard McCogan, or Keith Winham that speak to that effect. And finally, there is also a decline. Under pressure from English, Tagalog, and other languages from the Mindanao area, there are less and less speakers of Chabacano nowadays. And so nowadays, there's less than 500,000. Contested issues, a couple of them. When was it born? There are two main camps, these two. Right after the conquest or later on with the fortress in Zamboanga. And should we call it Creole? Because it's a highly ideological category that is not always rooted in strictly linguistic terms. So revitalization attempts are taking place, such as a yearly day of Chabacano, an orthography congress, translations of The Little Prince, two of which are different among themselves, even though they're both written in Chabacano. Goes to show you the plurality. And finally, I would like to conclude with this. I think that only a metalinguistic and decolonial perspective that emphasizes the centrality of variation across the global Hispanophone and language ideologies can help us to read post-colonial modern Spanish linguistics against the grain and to make for an emancipatory reading. This is the only way we can destigmatize Chabacano as a language that is worth on its own and doesn't need to be compared to any other. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very insightful and interesting presentation. And now we will go to the part with questions and answers. So far we have one question. Okay, I think I should. Of course, you can also you can still ask questions using a Slido. We still have some time. But so far we have one, if it's able to... Oh, okay, so I'll read the question for you. The first question is, what percentage of Filipinos speak Chabacano?
We're talking about, I said around 500,000, but the most recent estimates are 400,000. So you take 400,000, you take the whole Filipino population and get the percentage. That's the percentage of the population in Philippines that speak Chavacano. And it's also important to note that it's not a diasporic language, meaning 99% of the people who speak Chavacano at all are going to be living in the Philippines, right? Okay. And within that, around 350,000 people are based in Zamboanga, because the other varieties, Chavacano in Cavite, in Ternate, in Davao, are really slim to none. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, I study Palenquero Creole, and one of the current issues is spelling. How does Chabacano do it?
Very good question. Very good question. What happens with this kind of traditionally marginalized languages is that they undergo a process of normativity and standardization that is not equivalent to those we are used to in the case of modern languages such as French, Spanish, etc. Right? So a lot of people think that there is a final answer to how do I spell Chabacano? Well, this is not like Spanish where you have strict rules monitored by a Royal Academy, right? Meaning there are competing ways of writing Chabacano, and they are also mediated by ideological choices. Meaning, if I want to adopt a spelling that is closer to modern Peninsular Spanish, it's because I believe that the more Chabacano resembles Spanish, the better, and the more chances it has to survive. If I want to adopt a spelling that is different from Spanish, for instance, I want to write kun with a K as opposed to a C, then it's because I want to signify the autonomy of Chabacano as a Philippine language that is detached from Spanish or should be detached from Spanish in its sovereignty. So there is not a final answer. There are conferences and congresses devoted to agreeing on that. I'm currently partaking in a UTalk course on Chabacano. And so there are two translators of the corpus, just like in any other course. And we came to the conclusion that we'll adopt the one that is more similar to Spanish when in doubt, when it comes to spelling. But that is our choice, right? It's not by any means a universal solution.
I see questions still coming in, and there are a lot of them right now. So the next one is, what was the role of Muslim-Christian contact again?
So, two ways in which this interaction was significant. The first one is the Muslim-Christian conflict. For instance, the Spaniards took in 1635 the Zamboanga fort from the Muslims, right? And that gave way to the settlement of the speakers and therefore the language and the crystallization of Chabacano as a creole rather than a pidgin or a language that was exclusively used in the galleon trade. So those conflicts were at the origin of the existence of Chabacano and its crystallization into a creole after the Spanish or the Christians conquered the Zamboanga fort from the Muslims. Nowadays, Chabacano it is still used in some areas of the Philippines as a lingua franca between Muslims and Christians. Sometimes Muslims and Christians do not have any other common language but Chabacano. Well, that's another way in which that interaction is relevant. It's no longer necessarily conflictual, but actually the opposite, right? It serves to tend bridges.
Okay. The next The next question is Chabacano somehow officially used locally or taught in schools?
Yes, and that's the reason why, and I haven't mentioned this, so this is a very good question. That's the reason why Chabacano is not endangered to the extent to other languages of the global Hispanophone like Jaquetia or Yudesmo are. The fact that it's taught at school, that it has a curriculum that has been discussed, and I think I show it for maybe a fraction of a second, so you see here, introduction as a subject and a medium of instruction in the public schools of Zamboanga City from grade 1 to 3 since 2012. And that creates a lot of people who can have at least a basic command of Chabacano. So yes, and that's the reason why, while being vulnerable to the effects of Tagalog, Spanish, English, etc., Chabacano is not considered an endangered language nowadays.
Next question is in Spanish. ¿Tienes unas palabras chabacanas favoritas que quieres compartir?
Yes, but I can only say some of them. One of them, for instance, we saw in the dialogue was, I don't know if you caught this, but the woman said quiere at a certain point, right? So in Spanish we say encantar when you really like something, right? Me encanta esto. She said you quiere and whatever she liked. And that is unique of Chabacano, but can be understood by Spaniards. So that to me exemplifies very well that communion. That to me exemplifies very well both the communion between Spanish and Chabacano and the differences, right? We also see in other South Asian languages the repetition or reduplication, right, of expressions like saying, if you ask if you can do something in Mandarin, right, the answer might be kei, right, say it twice, which is not common at all in Spanish.
The next one, do we know why the use of the language has declined?
Yes, the reason I mentioned is pressure from other languages. As much as Chabacano is being destigmatized and receiving scholarly treatment, that is still a minority, right? It's a step forward, but there is still a large contingent of people that think that Chabacano is not as, quote unquote, useful for, say, socioeconomic purposes as Spanish or English, and they might be right. And so that is the reason why. It's pressure from other languages, particularly socioeconomic ones. Even the president of the Institute Cervantes of Manila in the Philippines claimed that, oh, you should learn Chabacano, because if you learn Chabacano, you'll be able to speak Spanish. So the whole point of Chabacano is that it is Spanish, right? And that is its usefulness. So I think we still need to get rid of a lot of that. Yeah.
The next one, what makes a language worth a preservation for non-native speakers? Academic interest, unusual language features?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. First, I don't believe in the existence of non-native speakers and native speakers, but that's a topic for another day. Check my YouTube channel. And the other question was, what makes it worth preserving? There's a lot of reasons. There are aesthetic reasons. I like the way this language sounds or looks, or the script in which it's written. There are cultural reasons. It encapsulates the history of a community which will be lost otherwise. And there are utilitarian reasons, such as mental health, for instance, which Gilad Zuckerman mentions in his book Revivalistics. It says that for people who have had a historical contact with the language, say, for instance, the sons or grandchildren of people who once spoke this language fluently, learning that has a healing effect, contributes to their mental health and well-being. So there's a plethora of those without needing to incur neo-Orphianism, which is the idea that every single language is a completely different world, and now I learn Japanese and I feel like a samurai. We don't need to go to those extents, right, to appreciate the uniqueness of languages.
The next question is, what is the percentage of Spanish words that Chabacano may contain?
The percentage of Spanish words that Chabacano may contain. As I said, to the extent to which Spanish is a lexifier, an overwhelming amount of words are coming from Spanish. If you want me to give a percentage, it will be 80% approximately. But then again, this is another question that people think have a straight answer, which is, where does this word come from? Sometimes it comes from many languages. Sometimes we don't know exactly what the chain of transmission is, right? So, but roughly 80%. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Next one, I think you've answered it in some parts. Does the Spanish government or others advocate for linguistic rights of Chabacano speakers?
No. No, it doesn't, unfortunately. When people teach, even at university level, as I know from my own experience, when people teach Spanish, and global Spanish now, which is a trend, they still conceive of it as Spain, Latin America, and maybe Africa. Maybe we'll talk about Equatorial Guinea, Haketia in North Morocco, but Asia is still pretty much outside of the frame, which is something we need to correct. So you will struggle to hear Pedro Sanchez talk about Chabacano. Right? I could bet a lot of money against that possibility. But you will not struggle to see Spanish politicians talking about, say, Euro-Spanish, right? Since the 19th century, giving passports to descendants of Sephardim, etc. So yeah, definitely Asia is still perceived as non-Spanish speaking, even though we've seen Chabacano today, or precisely this is the reason why I've tried to show Chabacano today to dismantle that prejudice, or even Chamorro, whom Brian Lu discussed in the presentation before, which is also influenced by Spanish. So there are languages in Asia influenced by Spanish that people need to take into account. And also Israel is also in Asia. Right? So technically, Judeo-Spanish is too.
Mm-hmm. We still have some questions, but I think we'll manage them. Okay. What are the main differences between Zamboangueño and Caviteño Chabacano?
So we only had one question, but this got complicated. Yeah, so Zamboangueño is more influenced by Cebuano as the substrate language, whereas, what was the other one?
Zamboangueño and Caviteño.
Yeah, so Zamboangueño is more influenced by Cebuano, and Caviteño is more influenced by Tagalog as substrate languages. But you'll be hard-pressed to find many texts in Caviteño, right, as opposed to Zambongaeño, because as I said before, Zambongaeño is 85–90% of the speakers that nowadays have a command of Chabacano in the world.
Would children still use Chabacano?
Hopefully. Yes, I think so. I think so because of the fact that it is part of the curriculum, that it is spoken at home, and is also spoken in domains outside of the home. So I think that, as I said, it's not an endangered language. If you go to UNESCO's document published in 2003, which establishes the conditions upon which we can determine how endangered a language is, intergenerational transmission is very important. Right? And so, for instance, Judeo-Spanish lacks intergenerational transmission. That makes it almost automatically an endangered language. Chabacano doesn't, which means it's very hard for Chabacano to be in a position of endangerment. So yes, children will speak Chabacano.
What is the best source to learn Chabacano in your opinion?
Okay, very good one. So if you want to invest money in traditional old-fashioned books, you can buy Un Poquito Español. I like the title because, it looks like Spanish, but it's different, so it's a very good summary. You can buy Un Poquito Español. I recommend that book. If you don't want to buy books and just want to search for something online, there's a very good blog called Bien Chabacano. Bien Chabacano, which means Chabacano comme il faut, properly spoken, which is interesting, right? Because it's that very prejudice which is at the origin of the marginalization of Chabacano historically, but yeah.
Are Chabacano speakers actively using social media and the internet to use or preserve their language?
Yes, didn't I mention for a brief fleeting moment, so this is bien Chabacano, by the way, some Facebook groups like El Zamboanga de Antes. Look how the title connotes the language as something from the past, but still using it on Facebook. So yes, there are some. I'm not going to say that it's as popular as English, but there are some groups that you can find on social media. Mostly Facebook because it's more text-based, right? Whereas TikTok, Instagram are more image, video-based. So if you want to practice, probably Facebook is the best one. Yeah.
Okay. And last two questions. The first one, is the language taught at universities today?
Yes, it is. I know of professors, one of whom translated The Little Prince into Chabacano, that teach Chabacano at universities. But there's a long way to go. So, for instance, in departments of Spanish in the US, which is the context I'm most familiar with, there are no Chabacano lessons. But there are Chabacano lessons in the Philippines. Now, the question is, who is going to go to the Philippines to learn Chabacano at the university? So we need to implement that at a university level because right now, most of the curricular implementation of Chabacano is in primary schools, right? But yes, there are.
And the last question for today, how has the language/grammar changed between the three phases?
So this is a very long question, right? But the answer is very short. It has changed from a rudimentary form of grammar and an overwhelmingly vocabulary influence from Spanish to a much more sophisticated form of grammar. We have, for instance, 26 different particles that are used as markers in Chabacano. And when you learn Chabacano and you're reading it, there's a very subtle understanding that plays when it comes to placing certain particles. So it has evolved in complexity and also in cultural significance. So when the Philippines were still part of Spain, it tended to be considered a Spanish language or improper Spanish. As the Philippines gained independence from Spain, it's like, wait, this is actually something I don't see around the Global Hispanophone anywhere in the world. This is actually part of our cultural treasure as Filipinos. So it has changed both in its linguistic complexity and its cultural valuation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That was the last question, actually. And so thank you again for the presentation and for the talk. And thank you for the questions. And thank you for the answers to these questions. I hope we are all happy. And now we have 15 minutes, a 15-minute break. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.